We've only just started to resettle the thousands of Afghans who are qualifying for special visas, but already Democrats want to open the floodgates to many, many more.
We must lift the refugee cap. We are going to have a cap that allows for more refugees to come into the United States. We cannot abandon these individuals, and we have to make sure that they all are transported out of Afghanistan because it is a very dangerous situation.
Now, these politicians know anything about what they could be actually inviting in along with good people. Well, my next guest says that Europe's experience with refugees, especially Afghans, should give Americans pause here. Just a few years ago, as a refugee advocate, she watched a horrible crime wave devastate Europe, and now she fears the same thing could happen here. Joining me now is Cheryl Bernard, scholar, director of the Medicine Analytics, and author of Civil Democratic Islam. Cheryl, tell us what we need to know about Europe's experience with Afghan refugees who began to be settled some years ago. Tell us.
So this was the wave, if you remember, that started in 2014. And the definition of that wave was actually that they were expecting Syrian refugees from that conflict. But then instead what happened was that a huge wave of refugees from a number of other countries, including places in Africa, but also principally from Pakistan and a large number from Afghanistan, kind of mixed in with that collection of refugees who were moving towards Europe, and was able to cross the borders in a situation that was very chaotic. And the consequence was, because these turned out to be, first of all, not Syrians. The Germans were kind of expecting that these were going to be Syrian families. There was this stereotype of the Syrian doctor who was going to come and establish himself, remember, in Germany. And
but who is in this big group of refugees? Because I know in particular my friends in Sweden who are basically, they're socialists, but they've become very anti-refugee, sadly, because of the crime that's happened. It's impossibly bad in Sweden with the crime.
Yeah, well, they were young. They were, in fact, young men. Let's talk about the Afghans, because they represented a large chunk of that. They were in their 20s and 30s. And they came alone without any families or women accompanying them. They often came from rural areas, and the culture shock for them of life in Europe, the freedoms, the status of women, these things just completely knocked them into a trauma that caused them to join criminal gangs, to gang together.
Well, what about the vetting, though, Cheryl? What about the vetting of these refugees?
Well, there was no vetting because it happened so quickly.
Do you think there's going to be vetting here? I mean, there's chaos at the airport. People are showing pieces of paper, and I work for this contractor, and I did. I mean, yeah. if you're bringing in,
so I think there's a different problem in Europe as there is here, and there's an important difference that has somehow gotten totally lost, and that if we don't recapture it, I think we're going to have enormous trouble. And that is, when I worked on the refugee topic, it was perfectly clear legally, administratively, in every way, that there were two different categories. There were refugees and there were migrants. And that is still the case legally, but somehow the two categories have gotten totally conflated, and that is what's causing a lot of this problem. A refugee was somebody who could not stay in their place of residence because it wasn't safe for a variety of reasons. Could be war, could be drought, could be famine. They were then relocated as close to their home as possible, temporarily, with the goal being to return them to their home as soon as that was possible. Somehow, though, a migrant, yes, the definition of a migrant was somebody who the country of immigration wanted or needed. Like they said, we need a person, we need electricians, or we need workers, or we need whatever it is, and so we're going to bring in a certain demographic. We're going to have visas for them.
So you're
now,
basically
every
saying
refugee thinks that
everyone's a migrant. Everyone
everyone's
qualifies.
a migrant, but why? It's a terrible idea. These young men, they weren't happy either. I mean, they ended up in jail, they ended up in gangs, they ended up addicted to drugs. That wasn't a happy outcome for them either, or for their families.
Well,
it would have been far better had they stayed in their region and been repatriated after a certain amount of time.
And it seems to be what you believe should be happening here, that most of the refugees should be housed, at least temporarily, in places like the UAE or Egypt or nearby, where they're culturally more in tune with the local population?
So in Europe, you had a demographic that was uneducated, young males, from rural areas. The demographic of Afghans that's now poised to come to the U.S. is different, and it has a different set of problems. There, the set of problems is that we, by creating this panic that you were describing earlier, evacuating the U.S. Embassy as if, you know, the sky was falling, sending in thousands of additional troops, we sent the message that the situation is about to completely collapse. There's going to be blood flowing through the streets, and everybody has to get out right away. Combined with messages on TikTok that all you had to do was get to the airport. You didn't need paperwork. You didn't need anything.
Yeah,
you were going to be flown.
A disaster. No,
you were going to be flown to the U.S. or Canada or France.
It's a complete disaster. Europe's
that was
experience.
A disaster.
Europe's experience, and
but Laura, think about it. Think about it. Our investment of 20 years. $2 trillion is not only lost in terms of the military, because we saw what the results of that investment was. They didn't even fight for their country for one day. They collapsed and ran away, you know, you stated earlier.
A disaster.
But we're also now emptying out civil society. We spent 20 years educating people,
building it, and then siphoning it off. All right, Cheryl, we got to go, but fascinating. We'll have you back. This is obviously going to be an ongoing issue. And based on Europe's troubling experience, should we be demanding answers now about how the vetting of these refugees, which may be migrants in some cases, would be done? So the drawdown was announced. The Center for Immigration Studies since then was monitoring a number of bills that would speed up the resettlement process to the detriment of our safety. Some being considered would mean that applicants would no longer have to show that they perform sensitive and trusted work to qualify, would no longer have to show that they're at risk if they stay in Afghanistan either. The number of visas available would nearly double, and the need for applicants to have a medical screening for contagious diseases for entry would be eliminated. Here now is Art Arthur, resident fellow of Law and Policy at the Center of Immigration Studies. Art, you feel it, right, that all the rules are going to be kind of thrown out the window and the floodgates are going to be open here?
Absolutely, Laura. There's a huge impetus for that right now. It's crucial to note that when it comes to vetting, first you have to identify the person, then you have to have access to some records that will tell you something about that person. When President Trump put in his travel restrictions, wrongly derided as a Muslim ban, the reason for those travel restrictions was because we couldn't identify people. We couldn't get access to documents, and some of those governments were hostile. Well, now we're in a situation where we have an Afghan government that's hostile to the United States, that's not going to give us information about the people who are coming here, and our ability to identify many of those people, particularly the ones who didn't work directly with the United States government, is going to be next to impossible. We're not going to know whether they have criminal records. We're not going to know whether they have terrorist ties. We're not really going to know anything about them at all. And yet there's a huge push to bring large numbers of them into the United States. And that's a big problem. That's a national security problem and a criminal problem.
I saw someone on, I think it was on Facebook, making an interesting point that in 9/11 you had all these loopholes or gaping holes in our system that were exploited by the Saudi hijackers. They knew that they go to a school, they could stay, or they could switch their visa or overstay their visa. And there's some concern that, look, there are going to be vulnerabilities here. At the very least, there's going to be an opportunity to game the system here. And who wants to game the system more but people want to do us harm? And if people think that's not a contingency, but you don't need to make a contingency plan for that either?
Yeah, I mean, that was the major finding of the 9/11 Commission report, that there were loopholes, that they were identified by people who wanted to do us harm, and they were exploited. I'm concerned that the same thing is going to happen here. We remember a few years ago, Ms. Merkel talked about, individuals who were infiltrating the streams of migrants to Germany. The same thing could very easily happen here. In fact, quite frankly and unfortunately, I think it's probably likely to happen here, and we're not going to know about it until it's too late. Yeah. That's why proper vetting of these individuals for national security risks is absolutely crucial.
Belgium, Germany, Sweden, 6 EU countries have been asking to be able to resume deportation of Afghan migrants before this whole thing went down. And I think some of them still want to send these people back, but I guess the EU Commission on Human Rights says you can't do it. It's too dangerous, obviously, now. But they've been trying to deport as many people as they can, as quickly as they can, but we're not listening. Art, thank you. We got to
Thank
roll,
you.
but thank you. We'll have you back soon. And who has a better communication strategy, the Biden administration or the Taliban?